Welcome to the podcast created by Ashoka, where we try to present a world where there are more solutions than problems. And today we have a great guest with us, obviously an Ashoka Fellow, Inge Missmahl, who's with us. So Inge, my first question, which will be for those of our listeners and viewers who know the podcast, it's going to be a traditional question. Why should I care about how we define mental health?
Well, good question, yeah? As long as you are healthy, perhaps you don't have to care. As soon as you know someone or someone close to you or someone in your family who has a mental health problem, I think you will care very automatically because mental health issues disrupt human connections in a big way. And why should you care on a bigger level, perhaps? Because there is something like a mental health crisis. At least that's what you read everywhere, and that's what you can experience depending on the countries you travel to. Or if you even look in Germany, from where I'm coming from, I think something like 26% of the population have symptoms of depression or something like this. So how can that be when we are living in such a safe and more or less reliable environment? Yeah. So we should care, I think, because it's somewhere there is a kind of a imbalance, yeah, between living standards and people suffering from mental health. That's one thing. But the bigger part of what we care for, and I think where we should care for, is people in countries where there is not much mental health care and where people are living under extreme stress and under experiencing traumatic situations. Just think of the recent examples of Ukraine and of Gaza and all the refugees we have here and all the refugees we have here in Europe.
So we should care about it, well, first of all, because it's a phenomenon that exists and that is around us, right? So I think it's important to name things that are around us. So that's one of the reasons why it's important. But I understand that, I would think that if we do have a mental health crisis, and I would like if you could just explain a little bit why you say we have this crisis, but also if we say we have it, well, it means that it might have some consequences, right?
Yeah, I mean, it has consequences on many levels. Let's stay for the moment in Western countries. Yeah? It has the consequence that it costs a lot of money for everybody, one consequence. And the other consequence is that people feel trapped and victimized in a situation and cannot have access to their full potential. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And I think this is something which I personally really care for, that people are not in a victimized position and then perhaps need to identify with something else in order to feel whole again, but that they can believe in their own creativity, in their own power to have influence and agency in their lives. There are wars in the world, yeah? There are many stressors around which are the same for all of us. And nevertheless, we are producing more of it. And at the same time, we need to take care of the victims of these events.
Why?
Why? Because, well, this is first a humanitarian mandate, I think. In there, I only can say the other is you. How can you be happy if somebody else is not happy? Yeah, I think this is something we should not question, yeah, because in the end we are all in the same boat. It doesn't matter what you name. So I think we have to care for each other, and for me, mental health is one of the key issues, because if people are vulnerable and if people feel powerless and victimized, then they cannot contribute to the society as a whole.
I used to travel to the Balkan countries after the war, after the fall of Yugoslavia and the creation of Bosnia and Serbia and Croatia. And what was interesting for me, it was something that I've learned by talking to people there. And I think it's a lot about working with trauma and what stays with you and in you after this kind of experience that war is, that war doesn't end when fighting ends.
Yeah, this is correct. The experience stays with you, but you can accept what happened. You can somehow and have to accept that it happened to you and that you suffered. And the question is, what do you make out of it? Yeah, is it for you something you are breaking? Your psyche is breaking, or is it something where you can say afterwards, okay, I experienced it. It was horrible. It was hell. But I will make sure, for instance, that this doesn't happen again, and I will contribute what I can contribute. So it is decisive that we support people who have experienced this, that they can recover and that they have someone to talk to so they can reflect on these things and also regain some meaning and with that also some perspective for their own lives.
And would it be a bit far-fetched to say that if we help people to recover, it's in a way peace building?
It is a precondition, I think, for civil society. I mean, mental health, or let's say psychosocial support, is a cross-cutting issue for any building up of civil society, for any. Because we know very well, trauma symptoms, for instance, come along with hyperarousal, with avoidance of emotions, of places. So if we don't want to make people more vulnerable by saying, okay, they are traumatized or they have post-traumatic stress disorder or something like this, but we want to help them to overcome it, yeah, and to live with it and to find and regain meaning for their life.
Right. And I think, I remember I actually use this, I'm not using the example of people running away from war in Ukraine, maybe because it's still fresh and it's very difficult for me to even think about what they bring with themselves. But with this experience after the war in the Balkans, I remember that many people who did not deal with those experiences, who didn't have help, or they felt, I'm not crazy. I'm not going to go to a psychologist,
yes.
Psychiatrist. Like, I'm not, especially I think in a macho culture, this is very difficult. Maybe it's just my, that's how I felt a little bit there. Like masculinity in the Balkans is very strong. That was a long time ago. I'm sure it has changed a lot. But I remember that many people, the way they dealt with those emotions was wanting revenge.
Yeah, I mean, this is the worst case scenario, yeah? I mean, we all know violence creates violence, yeah? So for any peace building, it is essential that, it is acknowledged what has happened. And that we have been engaged, and I myself, since 20 years in Afghanistan. And there we had a very interesting project in the last years where we did something like a collective trauma approach for peace building by acknowledging what has happened one to the other. So if another person can feel your pain, who might have been your adversary or with whom you want to have a revengeful relationship, usually that is very touching. If it becomes personal, you can feel the other person. And then the other person also says what was so horrible for them and why they felt like this. And once you start connecting on that level, reconciliation is possible and revenge becomes unnecessary. I mean, this sounds now very idealistic, but we have seen it in so many cases. It is a question of how you moderate the dialogue, how you acknowledge people in their dignity and in their own, that they can be in their own selves and they are not judged by what they say.
Right. And by, one of the elements of their identity.
Right.
That's how wars happen, is that I don't see a person, but I see someone who represents a group that I I can somehow depersonify, right?
Yeah, I mean, you identify with something bigger than yourself, and this then is for you the reason to be. So, and then you are disconnected from what you do and what you feel.
I'm just so happy that we went this deep. I think this is very important, and I hope that for our listeners, this connection between mental health, working with traumatic experiences, peace building, and then personal connection, I hope it resonates, because this is something that we will have to do in our region as well with the Russian war in Ukraine. We will. It's not like, again, that the war ends when the fighting ends. But I wanted to ask you more about what you do. So you said you spent many years in Afghanistan. What does your organization do? How do you deal with this challenge or opportunity? Because the way you present it is more like an opportunity.
I think it's more an opportunity, yeah. I founded this organization in 2008 after I had been 4 years in different countries. And it all started in 2004 after our children left the house, that I started to enter humanitarian aid. And my first assignment, by chance, brought me to Afghanistan. And by training, I'm a Jungian analyst, analytical psychologist. And everything what I had learned, I quickly saw that this doesn't really function. Yeah, so people would not come for 80 sessions because they felt depressed or couldn't manage their everyday life anymore. So,
excuse me. So what you're saying is that the methods that you brought from
Western countries, yes, they did not work, no.
Right.
And I first thought, well, I will go back home, It's not what I could do much there. But then I stayed and I learned slowly but surely by having a cultural teacher with whom I could discuss the cases and to whom I could explain how people reacted and what I didn't understand in their reactions. And through this understanding and deeper understanding of the culture, I understood why people reacted how they reacted. And slowly I also understood what would help and what would not help. And then,
could you give an example of something that didn't work and people reacted strangely, and then you got this cultural translation and it was...
I mean, for instance, if you ask somebody in Western countries, how are you and what do you feel? You will get a lengthy answer. Yeah, because we are all used to reflect on ourselves and to think, how do I feel and what is it this morning? And we do journaling and we do a lot of things like this. But if you have somebody who really is not feeling well and you can see it and you can feel it, and this person says, I don't know. I have never asked myself these questions. I feel nothing. I feel absolutely nothing. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Then you need to understand why a person is saying this and how can you approach the feeling. And after a while, perhaps somebody says, yeah, how do I feel? The relationships in my family are good. So, you see? And then you need to understand, which I didn't at that time understand and which I understand now, that somebody feels perhaps with saying, I don't know what I feel. I cannot allow myself to feel what I feel because it would bring me into conflict with my duties and with my role and with my commitment and loyalty to my family. Because you live in a collective society, in a collective Muslim society. And your commitment in the collective with your family has a higher value than how you feel and what you want. So these things really helped me a lot to understand emotional reactions in people. Yeah, because we all, let's say, have a perception of the world which defines the interpretation of what we see is defined by our values and by our cultural background. And if I want to understand why people feel how they feel, I need to understand their perception of the world. based on these experiences and after good analysis of what helped and what has not helped, and after studying many best practices of existing therapies, the result was what we call today value-based counseling, which is a psychodynamic short-term therapy or intervention. And this we implemented then first in Afghanistan. We evaluated it with randomized controlled studies. We implemented it also in other countries such as Sri Lanka, China, Haiti, after natural catastrophes, after the tsunami, after earthquakes. And it always worked because it's an intra-cultural approach. Yeah, we train people from the country to help people from their own country. So the cultural perception is the same, and people understand how people feel.
I had a very similar experience with the notion of leadership.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Leadership is perceived very differently in different cultures.
Oh, completely.
And we are kind of used to using the Western models.
Yeah. Because there are more publications.
Because there are publications.
Yeah. And also perhaps there are more research and more donor-driven projects, which certainly then follow those values. Yeah. No, this is clear. Yeah. And when more or less when we, 2015-16, all the people came to Germany and our health system was completely in need of something. So then we thought, why don't we do a knowledge transfer from the global south to the global north? So that's what we did. And we trained refugees in this value-based counseling approach. And today, I think we trained about 250 in Germany, and in Ipso, 40 to 50 are working. And we have this online system, and we have centers in Berlin and in Thüringen. And yeah, it's quite satisfying to see, that people who would not really find a place in the health system or only would then have a therapy with a translator, that they can have value-based counseling with one of our counselors and do feel better afterwards in most cases, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the concept of the value-based therapy? Because I understand that it is a lot about values.
Yeah, well, it is about values, but it's also that in that concept, first of all, it's a very structured conversation, which more or less in the first steps explores, let's say, the inner situation of the client. Yeah, meaning how is that person feeling in that moment? And the inner situation is defined by personal vulnerability, which was triggered by an outside psychosocial stressor. So more or less in a holistic approach, we see the person coming from a socio-cultural environment and living in a socio-cultural environment, and something triggered something in the person. So because of this, the person developed a mental health symptom, mostly out of the spectrum of depression or sometimes trauma or fear, anxiety, or people are over-demanded with life changes, whatever. But we need to understand what exactly is it. And then this is common understanding between the counselor and the client. So it is not like this that the counselor has the authority of interpretation, for instance, and the counselor also has not the authority to make a diagnosis and say, okay, you have a depression based on your symptoms as indicators. No. We can say, okay, perhaps you're the symptom. What is the personal meaning of that symptom that you want to retreat and you don't want to join others? Yeah. And you don't really have any bright perspective of your future. Yeah. And perhaps we find out in the case of a refugee that this young man was perhaps sent to Germany or to Europe to earn money and support the family at home. But that idea was based on wrong images and wrong assumptions about that situation in that country. And now there is first the integration course. One has to learn the language. There are no job opportunities. Before there is not the, B1 or B2 level of language. So at the same time, this young man doesn't dare to tell this to the family, and the family calls and he doesn't answer the calls anymore. So he feels ashamed, he feels guilty, and he retreats. So this needs to be understood. Yeah. And also when he understands that this is actually my problem, and like this, I will never be able to reach what I actually set out to in the beginning to achieve, then it is our experience once somebody understands the inner situation and becomes more conscious about it, usually the way out of it, or what that person can influence, what that person can do in the actual life, will then come as a solution. Also in this case, for instance, I have to explain to my family. I should not retreat out of shame and not talk anymore. No, I should communicate how it is here and think of together how can we bridge the time till I am at that point where I can support you, for instance. Yeah.
This is fascinating. And I think it goes back to the very, very initial question, like, why should we care how we define mental health? Because if you use medical terms to define mental health, in a way, I think it doesn't really help. Because if you tell me you have depression, I'm like, okay, good. So what do I do? Right? And I think quite often this is another part of this mental health crisis that you said, it's medicalized, right? So you have depression, this is a drug, take it, And I think that's also part of the problem, is that I want to know, I think it's a question that people ask very often, what's wrong with me?
Yeah, you are completely right. I mean, this, it's over-medicalized and it's over-diagnosed also. And it's difficult, We do want to do justice to people who really have a serious mental health illness or disorder. But I think, or what we advocate for, we should have within all health systems, we should have a stepped care model, meaning that there has to be a first intervention which is going without diagnosis. Yeah, where we can just say it is perhaps a stress reaction or another reaction to a very stressful situation the individual experiences. For instance, we have these diagnostic criteria, and they are all written down in the manuals. For instance, DSM-5 now, the American one. Can you imagine if a loved one dies, or if somebody you care for dies, and you have a reaction of grief, that is already a pathology. Yeah, that comes along with the diagnosis. So where are we? It means we have a normal human reaction. We can't deal with it alone or within the family or with friends. No, we need the help of experts. So we create something like a vulnerable self. And we create vulnerability by applying these systems instead of saying, okay, something is blocked, perhaps you are troubled or you are overwhelmed by something, but let us understand what is the meaning of this symptom. I remember so well, in Afghanistan, most people come and say they have a headache, yeah, because that's acceptable. You cannot say, I experience domestic violence. You cannot say, I am so afraid of that my husband will lose the job and we go again into extreme poverty. You don't dare to say that. So you say, I have a headache. So the first time I started these groups for Afghan women, I had in front of me, I don't know how many, 30, 40 women, and all had headache. And so exactly it meant for one person that there was in the background a family conflict. For one person, it meant that she had lost her husband. For another person, it meant that. So that's what we do in this value-based counseling, that we explore the personal meaning of the symptom. And it always doesn't end with, let's say, emotional or intellectual insights, it needs to go into action, meaning how can I influence my life, regain agency, that what stresses me so much, can be influenced and can be changed. So in a way, if you want, it is also an emancipatory approach, because it is training people or empowering people to have a self-efficacy, to take personal responsibility, but also to be ready to take social responsibility. And that all according to your values, But where does that end? It ends there where you touch the freedom and the well-being of others. So it is a very, I think, important way to have this as a first step in medical care. Then, if this doesn't help, and systems persist after 3 to 5 sessions, then people can go and see a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and do a full psychotherapy. That's okay then, But then you will have more than 50% probably, according to our last study at least, not necessarily entering a mental health career.
This is fascinating. And I think it's also beautiful what you're saying is that, it's something that we keep repeating, but I think it's easy to say it, but I don't think it's always happening, is that usually a conflict is even in a group, a conflict is a symptom of something that can be changed. That there needs to be some change. And when I hear you, I think, it's your body, your mind, your soul, your you telling you something is not okay, and you can change it. Usually.
We all know that from our own lives that there are blocks sometimes. We feel there is no flow in us. A symptom is nothing else but a crystallized energy where something is blocked and doesn't flow anymore. So if we have this, we have to ask ourselves, what is my own developmental task in the moment? So that I can overcome this problem, or that in the next time we have a similar constellation, I am not running into the same reaction. We all know, for instance, very well that, and we know it from our own lives, we are running again and again into the same problems till we have another way of dealing with them.
Well, I think this is fascinating, and I definitely would like to work with a value-based therapy or therapist, but not everybody has access to this kind of expertise. So what it is, first of all, to our listeners, and if you want to know more, you will find a link to the website in the description of the podcast, and you can see more information about what Ipsos does and how it works. But what it is that every one of us, let's say people who listen to us, they think, oh, that's interesting. I would like to work this way with my mental health, or I have someone I see, struggling, and I would love for them to be able to somehow experience this approach. Like, what could we advise to people? What could they do?
I mean, first of all, I think when somebody experiences such symptoms, you have to ask yourself, when these symptoms get stronger with me, what am I thinking then? What am I feeling? So pay attention to these thoughts and to these feelings, because they are more or less a little bit a key to your insight, what might be behind that. So to approach the meaning of it.
And I guess, one thing that I've learned it during the years is that sometimes I feel, for example, I feel angry. It's a bit like the title of this podcast, like, why do I care?
Yeah. I mean, for instance, you have a sudden mood change, let's put it like this, So something has influenced you. Something has triggered you, and you might not be conscious about it, because something in you has reacted. A certain vulnerability in you has reacted. Yeah. And then when you go along with it, I mean, it's good to have somebody to talk about it, but you also can more or less explore yourself. You can sit down and you can say, okay, what exactly triggered that? And why did it trigger me? Was the feeling accompanying it? Yeah. What was I thinking? Is that something which has something to do with me? Or how can I influence this situation which triggered me so that this situation doesn't occur anymore and I can sail safely around it or it changes? Yeah, usually it's about relationships, very often. Yeah, I mean, we also know, perhaps sometimes we can even identify. Very often we have in our life something like a dominant feeling tone. Yeah, it is like a glass of clear water, crystal clear water, and you put one drop of ink in it and it colors. So now you can ask yourself when you are so angry, what is this feeling tone of mine in the moment? Yeah, was I perhaps close to that? More or less the whole first part, and this is why I say it's psychodynamic. It is not just adapting to a situation. It is not just a problem solving of an evident problem. No, it is about exploring your emotions and defining your own developmental task in order to cope with it. Yeah. Nobody can relieve you, for instance, from decisions you just mentioned before, like people from Ukraine coming and how do they feel? Yeah, being here, knowing that their loved ones are there. For many of the Ukrainian refugees also in Germany, this is a big problem. How can I deal with it? So you can be a partner then in discussing this, exploring it. Yeah, the reasons for coming, what the different sides. The final responsibility and decision must always be with the person. Yeah, this is why the moment we do a diagnosis in mental health environments, there is a vertical relationship. It's a top-down relationship. Yeah, I tell you what you have. It would make me furious, honestly. How can somebody dare to say that? Perhaps behind my depression is very simply, a quarrel with my best friend or with my husband or whatever. Yeah. So you see, this meeting on eye level and meeting someone who really is non-judgmental and who has something like an authentic interest in me and who sees me. I think this being seen is, in our time especially, where everybody is connected but lonely. So this opening up and being seen allows the person to reconnect to their own feelings. And once this is done, there is always a rise in the consciousness about my situation, which opens up a field for action, and that's where we enter.
Perfect. I think there is nothing else to be added there. Thank you so much for this conversation. This podcast is produced by Ania Schlusserenka. It is edited by Lucian Lucimiński. And my wonderful guest was Inge Missmahl, who I hope you're going to explore a little bit more what she does. You will find all the materials in the description of the podcast. We will also fact check this podcast so that we make sure that the data we give you is precise and accurate. And why don't you just go and really see someone? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. My name is Agata Stafiej-Bartosik, and this was Ashoka's podcast, Why Should I Even Care? Thank you.
Thank you.